Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Chaim, who is the author of the newly published book, Ribbis in the Business World, which is published by Israel Bookshop Publications. So thank you for joining me.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Okay, what can you tell the listeners about this book, or this sefer rather?
Yes, so something I've been working on for a while. The idea really came about when I learned Hilchos Ribbis and just talking to people I mentioned learning Hilchos Ribbis, people that were dealing in either real estate or other areas of business had a lot of questions they wanted to know. And we realized there was a little bit of either not a lot of information or some misinformation, some confusion. So there really was to make a book that was clear, concise, structured, easy to read, easy to find. Ribbis is complicated, business is complicated, put them together, they're even more complicated. And the idea was to try to simplify it, to the best of our ability and make it easy for the reader to apply it to day-to-day life.
Yeah, it's something that comes up all the time. I'm sure many listeners or in business, certainly, and people that are not in business, it comes up, all sorts of issues. People buy a house, mortgages, it comes up all the time. I mean, I don't talk about much of the podcast, but I'm a real estate lawyer by trade, by day job, so this comes up all the time. People come up with all sorts of issues and questions that come up. So this is something that definitely could use more education and more knowledge about. Now, why another book on Ribbis, though? I think most people are probably familiar that Rabbi Reisman has a book on Ribbis, and there are probably others as well. So what's new and unique to this that you decided, okay, we need a new work on Ribbis now?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, regarding Rabbi Reisman's book, so I've probably read it 10 times. It's a phenomenal book. It's very comprehensive, very detail oriented. It's really phenomenal. I think my goal was to try to make it maybe a shorter book, a book that's 20, 30 years later. There's many shilohs here that probably didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. But also very much, I really tried to shorten it. I probably went through this 20, 30 times before we went to print. And we kept trying to simplify it, shorten it, and make it very clear and concise. So that was really the main difference. Less maybe scholarly, more just very, very, very much user-friendly and practical for the reader.
Right, so it's not scholarly, it's not lumdish, it's more a day-to-day. Here you can open it up. Obviously, if someone has a really, a shiloh, any shiloh, certainly complicated shiloh, they'll call Rav and they'll find out what's going on. But basics, people to understand, have an awareness, or themselves can understand the basics. So, we're not going to run through, I can mention some of the chapters and what we'll discuss, but there's a bunch of chapters. It's about 230 pages, so it's not a massive book, as you say. You have the first chapter is Prohibition of Ribbis, just breaking down what is Ribbis and all the basics. You have the 4 categories of Ribbis, which, we're not going to get into here, really, and the benefits then I'll just read some of the paragraphs so you get a sense. Chapters rather. Benefits given by the borrowers to the lender, benefits that violate Ribbis, Heter Iska Part 1, Heter Iska Part 2, real estate acquisitions, business formation and lending personal funds, guaranteeing a loan and joint business loans, when Ribbis was paid, business funding, and the concept of Ribbis in commerce. So I think, we can do a whole podcast on each one of those topics. But I think let's just talk about basic everyday situations to be aware of that include potential Ribbis issues. I think this is probably something you're asked all the time.
Sure.
Just to give a few bullet points here for the listeners.
Sure. So there's one more point regarding the book. So I try to structure it in 2 halves. The first half is more just a little bit of a background of many of the concepts. And the second half is really industry-based, industry by industry, going through the common shilohs. I'll tell you just the common shilohs that come up. I'll tell you real-life questions that I'm asked all the time. We have a hotline, one of the Ribbis hotlines that we answer calls on a pretty much daily basis. The main shilohs that come up today in the business world, there are a few, but today really it's people take out loans every day, all day. Whether it's financing for a real estate deal, whether it's business funding, everything revolves around financing, and it's getting more and more complicated to discern when is the money coming from a Jewish lender versus a non-Jewish lender. The Ribbis only applies from one Jew to another Jew, not from a non-Jew to a Jew or Jew to a non-Jew. The difficulty is how do you know when the funder is Jewish, not Jewish, a public company, it was bought out, there are a group of investors, so that's very, very complicated to figure out. A, when is it considered a Jewish entity? And B, how do I figure out when it is? Am I responsible to figure out how much research am I required to do? That's really something that really is very, very difficult. It's becoming more and more complicated the more that we have these large, Jewish-owned funds and private equity companies, especially. They keep continuously buying out smaller banks and smaller lenders, and there's this Jewish ownership really being spread around. You could do all your homework. You could take out a loan from a non-Jewish entity, only to realize a week later that was then sold to a new company, which you're not sure what the status of the new company is. So it doesn't end. That's probably the most common question asked, and maybe the most difficult question we have on a day-to-day basis.
Right, and I think what's relevant to most people, the average person, now you get asked all the time, is mortgages, and how do you know what the lender is and the bank, and some are. I mean, we deal with all the time. It's doing, bulk of our work is residential real estate, and there are a number of the lenders that are from. So there is a heter iska, and they sign a heter iska at closing. There are now, obviously, some banks, some lenders, they don't know. So I'm sure you get asked this, and people ask this, how do I know? How do I know? I was just talking to somebody. He's like, I don't want to, no matter what, I'm not using that. I'm going to use only this bank because I don't think they're from, and I don't want to use any from person. But he doesn't know. How does he figure it out? And he started asking me. He said, well, he goes with that lender, and then eventually this lender that's not Jewish, he doesn't have Riska, is going to sell the loan.
Exactly.
He goes, well, how do I know who it's sold to? I need a heter Riska. And he was going crazy.
But he's not wrong. That's the thing. It doesn't end because you think you're safe, and then it's sold. You get a letter in the mail 2 weeks later. It was sold to a new company owned by Jewish sounding name from Pennsylvania, who's you realize is not from Jews, refusing to do heter iska, and now you're sort of stuck. So it definitely it's definitely a pretty complicated scenario. Sometimes you're better off borrowing from a lender with a very good heter iska because they'll tell you who they sell it to. They'll tell you how it goes. It really depends. But there are people that won't use heter iska. They feel like they're like it's sort of a kula, and then they'll borrow from a bank, which is questionable ownership. I'm like, if you would just borrow from this, from funder with heter iska, who tells you who they sell it to, sometimes you may be better off.
It reminds me, it's not the same, but it's like the analogy is like after Pesach, the people that are like, I'm going to go to the Jewish store that did Mechiras Chametz and buy the pretzels and the bread and the chametz from that store, or you're like, no, I'm going to go to ShopRite or Target, and then suddenly all those posts you're seeing a lot, well, this one's actually owned by a person, not from a person, a Jew, and suddenly you're buying chametz of Pesach. It's what you're saying, like you do it this way, it's definitely done right, but even then they could sell it. So that's definitely, I think that's probably the number one issue that comes up all the time, and also related to real estate, you probably go, is the hard money lenders. Yeah,
same question. Sometimes it's more relevant to hard money lenders because sometimes it's small. They're more like niche lenders. They're smaller lenders. Many times with large public companies, especially mortgages sold on the third party market, like the much larger public companies, there may be less shilas there. Sometimes with the hard money lenders, they're smaller lenders and they're sold to other smaller purchasers. And then there are definitely many questions that with hard money lenders as well. Maybe even sometimes more complicated than when you take a mortgage that then sold Freddie Fannie. It goes to the very large. We know many times where it goes, and less shilas may sometimes come up, but hard money loans as well. Yeah, 100%. It's definitely a struggle. It's a battle, and it's only getting more and more complicated as we go.
What are the basics for people to be aware of with the heter iska?
Yeah, so just regarding what heter iska is, how it works. I know when I started this a few years ago, one of the bottom I spoke to told me that when you're going to deal with people, you have to have a 90-second explanation of heter iska. He said you lose people after 90 seconds, and it's very important that they know what it is, so you have 90 seconds to explain. But essentially, the idea of heter iska is, we know that on one hand, it is also for one Jew to lend another Jew with interest. Alternatively, it is permitted for a Jew to invest with another Jew and collect a return. Now, the question is, how do you differentiate between a loan versus an investment? And the basic answer is that when you lend someone money, all the liabilities on the borrower. It's irrelevant what happens to the money. If he uses it for an investment goes under, it's all irrelevant. The borrower, in all scenarios, has to repay the lender. In an investment, the investor's still liable. It's essentially, you didn't give the money up to the borrower. It's his equity. Wherever the money went, still belongs to the investor. And the liability, if something goes wrong, it's the investor's loss. So the main difference is a loan is the liabilities on the borrower, as opposed to an investment where the liability is still on the investor. So now you have someone who wants to lend money with interest. So we say, hey, you can't lend money. So what can you do? You can invest the money. Now the lender says, I don't want to invest the money. I don't want that liability. So what we do is we say, instead of lending the money, invest the money. However, we add on a few clauses that makes it very, very improbable that the borrower would actually where the lender would actually suffer that loss. We'll say, for example, if the borrower wants to claim that the money got lost due to an inus, something out of his control, it's his responsibility to prove it. He may have to make a shvua or bring edim, and in all practicality, it may be very difficult for the borrower to prove that, and therefore the lender has the right to assume that the money got lost due to the borrower's fault, and therefore, on a practical sense, to still collect his funds. So we're turning his loan into an investment. However, we're adding a few clauses that protect the lender, and therefore, in all practicality, he'll get back his principal and his return that he wanted to initially get.
What about some common benefits that violate Ribbis? These are all sorts of like side benefits that people talk about in business or in a transaction. Then like, oh wait, maybe that's Ribbis.
Yeah. So there's the basic thing. The basic rule of thumb is anything that a lender is requesting and that he feels entitled to get because he lent the money is generally going to be Ribbis. That's a rule of thumb. Like if you ask someone for a favor, like if you lend someone money, then you ask them to do you a favor. You even if it's not something that may be of monetary value, it's like, hey, could you put in a good word for me for this person? And you're only comfortable asking because you just lent him a large sum of money. Something like anything like that, and any entitlement that the lender has because he lent the money is going to violate Ribbis. That's really one basic rule of thumb. Aside from that, it's really any form of benefit, anything that the borrower is doing to repay a lender, whether that's during the loan, whether that's at the time of repayment, whether that's after the loan. You want to send him a present. You want to send him a nice meat board with a big thank you note. You can't do that. The lender can't accept it. And you could say, hey, it's Ribbis, I can't. Not allowed to accept that.
What about co-signers? Because this is my line of business. This happens all the time. Someone co-signs for their kid on a mortgage. What about that?
Yeah. So the concept of co-signer it's a big discussion in the Paiskim. Now, there's a few different levels of a co-signer, halachically speaking. There's what's called an arv stam and arv kablan. Arv kablan is a co-signer that the lender has the right to pursue the co-signer even without first pursuing the borrower. In such a case, it's a machlekes in the Paiskim, how we view that. And we paskin, at least, that when you have, even if the lender's a non-Jew who lends to a Jew, but then you have another Jewish co-signer, the concern is that if the co-signer ever has to pay the lender, the principal of the interest, he won't be allowed to recoup his principal and interest funds from the borrower. That's the idea of Arv Kablan. And it seems like in a practical sense, at least in America, the standard co-signer is someone who the lender has equal right to collect from. He doesn't have to first pursue the borrower, and only after the borrower defaulting in court, then go to the co-signer. Initially, the lender has the ability to go to the co-signer, which would seemingly make the co-signer Arv Kablan, which according to many Paiskim, you may run into problems. Again, in the event that the co-signer ever has to pay the lender, he won't be able to recoup his funds from the borrower. Therefore, in a practical sense, it's always suggested when you have a Jewish person co-signing on a loan, you write heter between the co-signer and the borrower. And we write that in the event it's ever considered that the funds came from the co-signer to the borrower, that's also being done according to the terms of the heter, and therefore everybody's safe. So it's definitely something that should be done. This is another very common question. People hear this, oh, I didn't do that. What do I do now? Again, it's less severe than a typical borrower, because it's only something that may potentially lead to Ribbis. There are ways to fix it up, going forward. But chatchila, definitely, it's highly suggested that when someone is co-signing on a loan, to make sure we write heter between the co-signer and the borrower.
One more kind of real estate related question, then we'll move on to another area, is LLCs or corporations, but LLCs. All the people buy an LLC, the LLC borrows, and so on.
Yeah, so there's a very, very famous tshuva from Ikras Moshe, and it's a big chiddush, and many places will argue, but Ikras Moshe holds that whenever we're dealing with a non-recourse loan, so essentially the lender lends money where there's limited access to collect the funds. He can only collect his loan from the LLC, from the company. However, if the LLC goes bankrupt, he can't pursue any of the owners personally. So Ikras Moshe says that a fundamental rule of a loan, a way the Torah recognizes halva, there has to be what he calls a shibud aguf. It has to be personal liability. Only when there's personal liability, that transaction is considered a loan. However, if you're lending money to an LLC, so to speak, and there's no one who has personal liability, the Torah would not recognize that transaction as a loan. And being that the Ribbis applies only to a loan, it would not apply to loan to LLC. And he says, if you're lending money to an LLC, a non-recourse loan, the Ribbis would not apply. Now, there are Paiskim Zalman has a tshuva. He has 4 or 5 really strong questions on the Ikras Moshe. Other Paiskim argue Moshe. many places can say, although they argue in Moshe, it's only the Rabbanan, but Al Kapanim, there are many Chalk Man Moshe. However, there is the opinion of the Moshe, and many people will rely on that. As a general rule of thumb, we tell people, if it's a question of Ribbis Deraisa, we try to be machmer. If it's a question of Ribbis Derabanan and it's LLC, there's definitely much more room to be lenient. Certainly, if we have another sort of, we call it like a sniffle huckle, if you have another svaral huckle combined with Ergus Meisha, there definitely is svaral huckle. But many times it helps us even in a situation where we're in a b'diavad, after the fact, where the borrower, they don't realize you need to have to risk or something of that nature. And if we're dealing with LLC, then at least b'diavad we're fine. So there are those that are machmer. But at least many times it's very helpful that after the fact, the first question we ask, was it recourse versus non-recourse? If it's non-recourse, we're generally in good shape because it's the Moshe.
Obviously, we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg. People can check out and purchase the book. And these are, obviously, also you shouldn't ask a shayla to a rav of any questions, not asking from a podcast. I always say when I have a halachic topic, like don't, obviously. But one more topic to talk about business is Amazon and e-commerce. These are things that come up all the time. So what are some common issues there, and what are some things that people should look out for?
Yeah, so a little less known is that the Ribbis applies many times in commerce, not just in Hava. At least when the Rabbanan there are certain scenarios where the Chaim felt that certain transactions resemble a loan, and therefore they ask, or at least the Rabbanan. The two basic concepts are when someone either prepays for a purchase, meaning he's advancing funds. He's not receiving the item right away. He's advancing the funds. And he's in exchange of the fact he's advancing early, he either gets a benefit, either gets a discount, or he at least is guaranteed, he locks into the price. So the Chum view that as you're advancing funds, which we consider a loan, and receiving a benefit in return. That's one example. Or the opposite scenario is, let's say, where it's very, very relevant. You have a vendor who's selling something, and he allows the buyer to pay on credit. So net 30, net 60, whatever that is. And in exchange for the ability to pay on credit, the buyer pays a higher, either a higher price or some sort of interest charge, something of that nature. So there too, even though it's inherently a mekach, it's a sale transaction, but since you're charging the buyer a higher price, being the fact that there's a right to pay on credit, the Chacham felt that resembled an interest-bearing loan, and they asked that as well. So it's really to keep in mind is if you're ever receiving money early or allowing the buyer to pay late, those are two different scenarios which could resemble a loan. And if the borrower, in that sense, is receiving if it's giving some sort of benefit to the lender, that would definitely resemble a loan. So a lot of vendors have this issue, when they're allowing people to pay on credit and they're offering two-tiered pricing. That's something which is very common. Or alternatively, if they're receiving the funds early, when the item is not in stock and they're guaranteeing the price, those are certain areas you have to be careful about.
Who's your book meant for?
It's a good question. I guess for a lot of people, I really think it's meant for a lot of people. It's not one. It's anybody who's in business who is trying to be careful with halacha. I try to keep it simple enough that anybody who maybe is less familiar with halacha, Hilchos Ribbis, who can look at it, but also I add a lot of footnotes on the bottom to make it more descriptive and a little more background for someone who is more learned. So I try to, it's really, I think, relevant for anybody who deals with business in a day-to-day setting, who is, tries to be meticulous about halacha in general, Hilchos Ribbis specifically, but also try to add more, to the bottom where someone who is learned, who is familiar with a lot of halachas, can definitely appreciate, some more depth as well.
What are you trying to accomplish with the book? Very simple.
It came from a need that I saw personally, where people just didn't seem to have much knowledge of Ribbis, confusion, a lot of surprisingly people that in all other areas of halacha would never violate anything, basar v'chalav or anything, Shabbos, things that just didn't happen. They would fall into snares of Ribbis Deraisa simply with the fact they were not aware of certain scenarios. It's really just to give a book that's easy, that's simple, that's clear, user friendly. I have at the beginning of the book an index, industry base, that it really goes to industry. Let's say, for example, the real estate industry. I'll start with financing, where to find the book, how to determine Jewish ownership. Then regarding when is an investment considered an investment versus a loan, operating agreements that violate Hilchos Ribbis. So every industry, I have an index that goes step by step what the basic shalos are, just to make it easy for someone to look and find his question and just raise awareness to many of the common problems.
Okay, so the book is available in local farm stores, available online. I'll put a link in the show notes for those interested can purchase a copy. And thank you for joining me to discuss the book.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.